Hi everyone, and welcome to the second part of the phonetics lecture. In this part of the lecture, we'll be looking at the place of articulation and how that can relate to the different types of sound we make using that place of articulation. So the previous part, we just looked at these places of articulation, or these different organs in the mouth. And in this part, we'll be looking at the sounds that we produce with each of these places of articulation. So the places of articulation that are going to be most relevant to English are the lips, the teeth, the alveolar ridge, the palate, and the velum, or the soft palate. Okay, so the first place of articulation that we'll talk about is the lips. The lips are used in a few different types of sounds in English. The first type is what's called the bilabials. So bilabials, if you're familiar with your old word roots, means two lips. So these sounds that are bilabials are formed using both of our lips to kind of obstruct the air moving through the mouth. The bilabials in English are here going to be represented by the letter P. So that's going to make a sound something like P. The letter B will make a sound something like B. The letter M, that makes a sound something like M. And the letter W, which will make a sound something like W. So these four sounds all use both lips to kind of obstruct the airflow to some extent and produce these different types of sounds. So one other little distinction we should make between some of these bilabial sounds is what's called a voiced bilabial sound and a voiceless bilabial sound. And these voiced and voiceless pairs can definitely apply to more sounds than just these bilabials. So if you kind of make sure you pay attention to what a voiced and a voiceless sound is here, because we'll be using those terms a lot. So if you try making the sound represented by the letter P, P, and then the sound represented by the letter B, B, we actually have essentially the same motion with our lips, and we make those sounds the same way as far as the mouth is concerned. The main difference between the P and the B can be found if you try putting your hand on the front of your throat when you say them. So try putting your hand on your throat and make the sound represented by the letter P, or P. And then do the same thing and try making the sound represented by the letter B, or B. When you make the sound represented by the letter B, your vocal cords, and hence your throat, are going to have a lot more vibration. So this vibration is what's called voicing. Essentially, with the P and the B, we make these sounds the same way, but in the case of P, our vocal cords aren't vibrating, and in the case of B, our vocal cords are vibrating. So there are a few other sounds that are going to have this voiced or voiceless distinction, but otherwise be made the same way. So P and B are one type of pair like that. M and W are just other bilabial sounds. Those are not a voiced or voiceless pair, though. We do see another voiced, voiceless pair in the set of sounds called the labiodentals. So the labiodentals are made using both the lips and the teeth. So basically with these, we will take our lower lip and kind of contact it with our upper teeth and blow some air through there. So in English, the labiodentals are, for now, going to be represented by a letter F and a letter V. The letter F will represent the sound F, and the letter V will represent the sound V. So try putting your hand on your throat for a second and seeing which one you think is voiceless and which one you think is voiced. You can pause the video if you feel like doing that, or if you don't feel like doing that, I'm about to give you the answer. The F is the voiceless sound, so that means our vocal cords aren't vibrating when we make it. And the V is the voiced sound, so our vocal cords are vibrating when we make it. So another type of sound so the first one that doesn't really involve the lips at all is what's called a dental or an interdental sound. So with this type of sound, we are basically contacting our teeth with our tongue and kind of blowing some air through that. So we have two words here to kind of represent the dental sounds. We have thick and we have this. So in English, these two sounds, and they are two sounds, are represented by the same set of letters most of the time. It's just something about how we write English. But basically, these are two different sounds that are both represented by the letters TH in English for the most part. So to kind of see that they really are two different sounds, try putting your hand on your throat and saying thick, and then do the same thing and say this. When you say the TH sound in thick, you'll maybe notice that your vocal cords aren't vibrating, so it's voiceless. But when you say the TH sound in this, you will maybe notice that your vocal cords are vibrating, so it's voiced. That's just another example of a voiced and voiceless pair. So a lot of the sounds in English will have these voiced and voiceless pairs. Basically, they're made in a very similar way. It just so happens that in one of the sounds, our vocal cords are vibrating, and in the other sound, they are not vibrating. So another place of articulation is the alveolar ridge. When we make sounds using the alveolar ridge, typically we kind of obstruct the air in the mouth by touching our tongue blade to the alveolar ridge or bringing it close to it and kind of blowing air through that obstruction. So some of the sounds made on the alveolar ridge in English are frequently represented by the letter T and the letter D. So that will be a T, which is voiceless, and a D, which is voiced. Then there's the letter S and the letter Z. So that's a S, which is voiceless, and a Z, which is voiced. We have the letters L and R, so L and R. Those are both voiced. They're made in slightly different ways, which we will see when we look at the manner of articulation. But they are both voiced. And then we have the sound represented by the letter N, which is N. So that is another voiced sound. And basically these are the sounds in English made using the alveolar ridge and to some extent the tongue as well. So we also have what are called post-alveolar or palato-alveolar sounds. These are made somewhere between the alveolar ridge and the palate, the soft palate or the velum. So basically, these sounds are going to have voiced and voiceless pairs in English anyway. The examples we have here are the first sound in the word ship. So in English, that's usually written with SH. And then we have the kind of final consonant sound in the word rouge. So sh and j are those two sounds. Those are a voiced and voiceless pair. That means, again, that they're made the same way, except that for sh, our vocal cords are not vibrating, so it's voiceless, and in j, our vocal cords are vibrating, so it's voiced. Then we have chug and jug. So in chug, our vocal cords are not vibrating, and in jug, they are vibrating. Otherwise, those two sounds are made the same way. So the sh, j, ch, and j sounds in English are all made at what's called the post-alveolar place of articulation. We also have palatal sounds. So these are made kind of around the soft palate. We have in English essentially one main palatal sound, which usually corresponds to the letter Y in a lot of words. So the y in young or the y in yellow, those are both the same palatal sound, just two different words that have it. We also have the velum, or the soft palate, which is kind of a little bit farther back in the mouth. So these sounds in English typically correspond to things like the letter K or the letter G, or the sounds that are usually represented by those. So a few examples, we have cat, bucket, and crib. The K sound in those are all an example of a sound made at the velum. The same with gas, go, and bag. So you might notice that K and G are actually a voiced and voiceless pair. So the K and the G are made the same way, except in one of them our vocal cords are not vibrating, and in the other they are vibrating. Then we have sing, and the ng sound kind of represented by the ng. That's another example of a velar or of a velar sound. So you may hear someone call a sound made at the velum a velar sound. So the ng in sing is an example of a velar sound. So those are the velar sounds, or the sounds made at the velum or soft palate. There are also some sounds made using the vocal folds or the glottis itself. So in English, we have what's called the glottal stop. This typically isn't represented by any kind of letter or anything in English, but it is a sound that's actually there. It's really hard to hear or produce in isolation on its own, but you can kind of hear it in the words uh-oh or Hawaii. So basically it's kind of sounds like a little bit of a pause in between and o, but we are actually making a kind of minuscule sound there using the vocal folds. So voicing that I kind of described to you before is just kind of codified here, and kind of described in a probably more detailed manner than I gave you earlier in this little video. But voicing involves the vocal folds and the glottis, and basically the glottis or the vocal folds are vibrating and just kind of changing the path of the air that moves through them as they vibrate. So as we kind of looked at, it's the difference between the p and the b, or the d and the t. So if you want, you can kind of go back and look at all those consonants we looked at and see which are voiced and which are voiceless, and just see if you can really notice that distinction. So we have some consonants that are voiced, some that are voiceless. One thing to mention, and we'll see this when we get to vowels, but all vowels in English are actually voiced. Okay, there's one other thing to kind of mention about the sounds of English and places of articulation. And this is kind of leading us into manner of articulation. We do have something to consider called nasality. So nasality basically means that when we have a nasal sound, we will actually have air flowing through our nasal cavities. This happens because we can open or close the velum or the soft palate. So this kind of lets the air flow through the nasal cavities if the velum is open, or if it's closed, it prevents air from flowing through the nasal cavities. So we end up with what's called an oral sound, or a sound produced using only the mouth. So in English, we have the nasal sounds m, n, and ng. So these are typically in English represented by letters like M, N, or the NG combination. Okay, so next up, we will be looking at manners of articulation. I am going to kind of pause the video here to give you a chance to maybe collect your thoughts about place of articulation, take a break, maybe look at it the next day, something like that. So when you look at the next video, that will be when we really look at manners of articulation.